right, we're going to be factoring perfect square trinomials. And so we're going to try to figure out what this perfect square trinomial means first, and then we'll start the factoring process. The word trinomial means there are going to be 3 terms. Okay? 3 terms, so that's what we are going to have there. The perfect square, you started off with something like y plus 2, and you squared it. This is not a trinomial, this is a binomial. You took a binomial and you squared it, and when you did that, you got a trinomial, and this was a perfect square trinomial because it came from, it was squared, so if we went backwards, we could get a perfect square when we're done, okay? So we're going to start this factoring of the perfect square trinomial. So now that we know what a perfect square trinomial is, let's now break down what factoring means, okay? When you were in elementary school, you multiplied 2 times 3 equals 6, and you learned the name for the 6 was the word product. You also, I hope you remember that the word for the 2 that were multiplied were the factors. And so you're going to be getting the product today and asked to find the 2 factors. So let's practice multiplying them. Let's actually start with the factors so we can learn something about them so that we can find some patterns to go backwards with the product. So I hope that what you'll do right now is, since you're going to be watching this going forwards, instead of watching it after we're doing your presentation like we usually do, why don't you go ahead and pause the video right now and actually write down what I just wrote down. If you need to rewind it a little and find out what I've already done, go ahead and do that. Write down the stuff that I did back here, and then we'll go forward. Okay? Come back when you're ready. All right, write down this problem right here. I want you to do that problem, and I want you to square it out. You've done this for homework before. Pause it while you're doing it and come back and check yourself. See if you got it right. All right, we're going to do that. I got y squared. I'm going to get the 49 because that's the 7 and the 7. And then to get this, I'd multiply the 7 times the 1 that's in front there. That's 7. And I multiply by 2, so that's plus 14x. Okay? Let's do another one. We're going to do this one. I want you to do the same thing. Do this one on your paper. Pause it while you're doing it. Come back and let's check it. Okay? All right. I'm going to get the x squared. That's from squaring that part. I'm going to get a 25. I'm going to get a positive 25 because that's 5 squared. And then what I do to get this middle term is I multiply that 5, actually in this case a negative 5, and the 1 that's in front of that x, and I get 5. Double it and I get a 10, but since it was a negative there, I'm going to get a minus 10x. Let's analyze this for a moment, okay? This number right here on the end was always this last term squared. We have 5 squared was 25, and the 7 squared is the 49. This middle term, let's analyze that, okay? How in the world could I jumped to it by doubling, in this case, that one right there. Especially if there wasn't a coefficient, there was only a 1 in front there. And I doubled that one to get this one here. Okay? Let's now try to see if we can go backwards. We're going to talk about the factoring now. We're going to start with this one and try to go backwards to the factor. But first of all, we need to check to see, is this a perfect square trinomial? Perfect square trinomial, is it? So what we have to do is check. So let's go back and analyze this. I got the 49 right here. 49, the square root of 49 was 7. And how does 7 relate to the 14? Well, If I take 7 times 2, I get 14. Is that the same over here? Let's check it. The square root of 25 is 5. And how does 5 relate to the 10? It's doubled. This will happen for all perfect square trinomials as long as the coefficient in front there is 1. So let's check. Is this a perfect square trinomial? We're going to take the square root of 64. That is 8. And if I double it, I get 16. So yes, this is a perfect square trinomial. Your problems in your book today will have some of them that are not perfect square trinomials. And so you're going to have to check. So we can answer yes, and now we can start. We're going to have parentheses here, and we're going to have a squared. The square root of always goes in there. So 64, the square root of 64, we did it a moment ago, was 8. The square root of this one goes right here, which is x. But what symbol goes in there? Is it a negative or is it a positive? So let's go back to our original, our 2 experiments back there. See if I can get rid of some of this extra stuff over here. All this extra stuff, it gets kind of confusing. Let's see what we can do here. All right. This one had a positive here, and this one had a negative. Is there a relationship over here on these between those negatives and positives? Well, I have a positive here, and I have, a positive there, and I have a positive there. There is a relationship. There is a pattern. I have a negative here, and I have a negative here. So it looks like I will look at this symbol to decide the symbol that goes in there. So is this going to be a negative or a positive? I'm going to look right here, and it's going to be a negative. I have factored that perfect square trinomial. Let's do another one. First of all, is this a perfect square trinomial? Yes or no? Let's look. I take the square root of 49. It is 7. If that is not a perfect square, you can stop and say, no, this can't be a perfect square trinomial, because that isn't even a perfect square root. Then I come over here and I take my 7 times 2 and I look up there to see, is that 7 times 2? No, it's supposed to be 14. So I can be done. There's no factoring to be done. This is not a perfect square trinomial. We can just say no, and we're done with that part. There's no factoring for this one, at least not in the perfect square trinomial department. This is not a perfect square trinomial. Let's do another one. Is this a perfect square trinomial? Let's check. I take the square root of 9, which is 3. I take 3 times 2. Is that right there? Yes, it is, because it equals 6. So I can factor this in the perfect square trinomial. All right, so I put my parentheses. I take the square root and I put it there, which is 3. I take the square root of that and put it there, which is x. Remember, what symbol goes in here? I look at that one and just place it right inside. It's a positive. I have factored that perfect square trinomial. Let's try another one. All right, we're going to do one in a moment where I will have a coefficient in the very front. But before we do that, let's actually multiply one that has a coefficient in the front. And then we're going to find some patterns so that we can factor that one. All right, so I said that I take that and I square it. Well, it'll be 9x squared. And then I'm going to square that one. Well, it'll be 4. But to get this middle term, I multiply the 3 and the 2, and then I double it. So the 3 and the 2 makes 6. And then doubling it makes 12. So I'm going to have plus 12x. And we always put a plus there. All right, so let's analyze this. How do we determine this one if it's a perfect square trinomial? Because we're going to have to ask the question, and we know for sure this one is. But we're going to have to analyze this one over here to see if it's a perfect square trinomial. Now I have a coefficient in front. So this has to be a perfect square. If I took the square root of 9, I have to get an integer. Actually, a whole number, a positive number anyway. And so this is a perfect square trinomial because I get a 3. Right here, 4 has to be a perfect square. It is. I get 2. Then I'm going to have to take this 3 and the 2 and somehow do something with it to get 12. Just like back here, I had to double to get the 6 after I took the square root of 9. I will double the 3 and the 2. I will double it. That does make 12. So there we go. So let's review that real quick. My coefficients in front have to be perfect squares. And then I take the roots, the 3 and the 2, multiply them together, and then double it to see if this one, if I equal that one. If I do, it is a perfect square trinomial. So let's check. Is this a perfect square trinomial? Square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 4 is 2. And then I take the 3 and the 2, multiply them together and double it. And this is 6 times 2 is 12. Yep, this is a perfect square trinomial, so now I can factor it. Let's do it. I take the square root of that and put it here, which is 2b. I take the square root of this one and put it here, which is 3. And then I look at this symbol, and I put it in there, and I have a plus. We have factored the perfect square trinomials. This was a review, or excuse me, a lesson involving factoring perfect square trinomials. We are finished.